The Prophecy of Isaiah. This is presentation 18 in the series, and it's been entitled Two Choices. Let's just look back at the last presentation for a moment or two. Isaiah focused on the central importance of leadership. He was thinking of political leadership and spiritual leadership, which were heavily entwined in the culture of his day. That is always true. And we saw many quotations from the book of Proverbs. We have to remember that the only kind of political leadership that they knew in those days was that of an autocratic king. They didn't have democracy as we know it today. But the leader and those around the leader advising them, how important they are if a people group, a nation, is to move forward. And you can describe it in terms of this. Good leadership is central, and Judah was lacking good leadership for much of its time. Yes, there were some good kings, but the leadership elite group as a general group, not very good. But good leadership has wisdom. They know what to do because they're listening to God. They bring justice. Everybody is treated fairly, equally. They bring security to a people group, and people can get on with their lives and live prosperous and successful lives. They bring stability. Much of that was lacking in the days when Isaiah was around. Leadership is so important. I want us to go back to one critical section that we looked at last time. For the Lord is our judge. The Lord is our lawgiver. The Lord is our king. It is he who will save us. Your rigging hangs loose. The mast is not held secure. The sail is not spread. Then an abundance of spoils will be divided, and even the lame will carry off plunder. No one living in Zion will say, I am ill, and the sins of those who dwell there will be forgiven. This brings the key answer for leadership. God as leader. He made us, He made the world, He made the universe. He knows what's best. And we have this lovely picture. Judge in the sense of the champion of his people, like in the book of Judges. The leader who stands up. God's on our side. He wants the best for us. He offers us a lifestyle direction because he knows the best kind of lifestyle which will give us full enjoyment and fulfillment. And when he rules, when we choose to make him our king, he's able to deliver us and protect us no matter what life may throw at us. He will take us through, enable us to cope, enable us to cope well. That's a beautiful picture. The Lord's there for us. He rescues. He protects. Then there's the contrast. You can see it in the next sentence. This is a picture language, poetic language. What Isaiah was saying is the ship of state's in a crippled mess. And indeed Judah at that time was in a crippled mess. Threatened by nations around, but now threatened by the great onslaught of the empire of Assyria moving south. Leadership in a mess, didn't know what to do. People lining their own pockets at the expense of the masses. The ship of state's a crippled mess, but it needn't be that way. God will be there if we will make him our king. And then the spoils will be divided. And even the lame will carry off plunder. Life will be great and wonderful. And this beautiful picture, this is what it could be. We face God knowing that he has forgiven our sins because we've turned to him, not because we're good, not because we're worthy, but because God is love, and God's there for us. That when we seek his forgiveness and help, he's there to forgive and help. He will protect us from illness, disease, the disasters, the troubles of the day. And indeed life will be rich and full, the spoils and the plunder. As so always, Isaiah paints the picture of two contrasting situations. If we make the Lord our King, God will do all that for us. He's on our side. But he looked out in Judah, and he saw a nation, a people group, spiritually and politically in a crippled mess. And he was calling his people back. And they didn't listen. Isaiah is speaking about kingship, rulership at two levels. That's what the nation needed. Yes, Hezekiah was a good and a great king in many ways. But the very fact that it drifted back to even worse with his successor showed that at the leadership class level things were not good. But he's speaking about spiritual leadership, which was in a dreadful state at that time. The religious system was running, but the reality had been lost. God, as it were, had been squeezed to the margins of life and was no longer seen as relevant to the practical things of living. And what Isaiah here was picturing, leadership, no longer false, no longer self-serving, no longer in it for themselves, which is what was happening in his day, but a leadership operating with integrity, a leadership that saw itself as serving the led. That's true leadership. That's great leadership. And he gives us a most amazing picture. It's worth rereading this section again and again. It gives us wonderful insights into the leadership that you and I need, we all need, societies need, and the people of God need in particular. And we can see it fulfilled so beautifully in Jesus, the great leader who came not to be served, but to serve. Now let's move on. Isaiah presents us with two choices. These two choices have run throughout the texts throughout, but here they're brought in a clear contrast over two chapters. Chapter 34 looks at the kingdom of mankind when we run our own affairs. And chapter 35, when we let God direct us. That's our choice as individuals, as communities, as Christian communities, as people groups and as nations. It's our choice, it's your choice. And what Isaiah does here, he pictures it poetically. When we run our own affairs and do it our way, it's as if we turn a productive land into a desert. But if we let God be our king, God turns the desert to become productive land. A beautiful contrast in these two chapters. Two possibilities. So let's look at chapter 34. Come near, you nations, and listen. Pay attention, you peoples. It's addressed to all the people groups, but he's speaking to Judah. Let the earth hear and all that is in it, the world and all that comes out of it. The Lord is angry with all the nations. His wrath is on all their armies. He will totally destroy them. He'll give them over to slaughter. Their slain will be thrown out. Their dead bodies will stink. The mountains will be soaked with their blood. All the stars in the sky will be dissolved, and the heavens rolled up like a scroll. All the starry host will fall, like withered leaves from the vine, like shriveled leaves from the fig tree. Now remember, this is poetry. And in the Hebrew mindset, anything that happened, God did it. But in a sense, this is what happens inevitably when people groups run their own affairs. And what was happening then was that the people groups around Judah, and in particularly Assyria and Babylon, they were persisting in attacking the people of God, mocking them, mocking their God. This is what happens when people reject God deliberately. Now, it's not God coming down in a great ton of bricks upon them. It's simply that when we do this, we produce a kind of inner cancer in our societies, destructive, and our social structures fall apart. These people groups just persisted in rejecting God's ways. They thought they knew better. But in fact, if you look at the ways they lived, they were brutal, violent, selfish. Some of the religious systems did dreadful things, including child sacrifice. They'd pushed God right out. They ran their own affairs. And history shows that when you do that, you end up turning your society into a desert. It falls apart. This is a picture here, poetic picture. When we continually and persistently push God out and embrace what is evil, then the powers of darkness, the angels of Satan, start to infiltrate. Then we find we can't escape from these evil ways nearly so easily. They grip us. They're habit forming. These are all different ways of saying the same thing. We must never take these pictures literally. They're symbolisms, figures of speech. The language is vivid. The language is typical of the kind of poetry of that age. And we have to interpret it the way the poetry was written, or in this case spoken. Just want to draw attention to that phrase. We'll return to it in a moment or two. Totally destroy. It's difficult to get our heads around the idea of God allowing total destruction. Total destruction of a culture and a society. We find that uncomfortable, but I'll come back to the moment because it reappears. My sword has drunk its fill in the heavens, see it descends in judgment on Edom. Now Edom is one of the nations that wasn't mentioned earlier in the book, but Isaiah is using it as typical of all the nations. The people I have totally destroyed. The sword of the Lord is bathed in blood. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Bozrah the capital. And the wild oxen will fall with them, the bull calves and the great bulls. Their land will be drenched with blood, and the dust will be soaked with fat. For the Lord is a day of vengeance, a day of retribution to uphold Zion's cause. Edom's streams will be turned into pitch, her dust into burning sulphur. Her land will become blazing pitch. Again, it's poetry, vivid poetry, and must be interpreted that way. In fact, the land of Edom was completely overrun and wiped out. And it wasn't that far in the future. But Isaiah isn't specifically referring to Edom because the first part speaks about the nations. He's saying, well, Edom's typical, and it's best understood that way. It's an example of what's going to happen. Edom was next door, and the people of Judah could see it. And in due time they did see it, because Edom did immense damage to the people of God. They picked off bits of the land, and when Judah was weak, Edom infiltrated yet again. A land that lived by trade, by making its wealth that way. It controlled the trade routes. Said we return to that phrase, totally destroyed. The idea of God totally destroying a people group. Now Edom was just wiped out. The Nabateans from the north just flattened them. But they'd been attacked and flattened before by Babylon. and then they were picked off and finally knocked out completely. They didn't exist. As a nation, they just didn't exist. They ceased to exist. Totally destroyed. Now we have to remember again that in Hebrew thought, the Hebrew mind saw that God was in control of everything. So it puts God as causing it. Now in fact, when a people group rejects God again and again, then their culture and society corrupt. And in a sense they implode. They don't have the strength to stand against opposition, and they are destroyed. So there's an inevitability of it. But the Hebrew way of looking at it is it puts it in God's mind. But just follow through the argument of this phrase, totally destroyed. Very difficult to translate. Everything belongs to God. Where a people group persistently rejects God in every way, then that's what happens. Now you may find that uncomfortable, and those who do not follow Jesus reject that. They think you can get ethical and moral standards without going the way of Jesus. Now history shows that what I'm saying is right. That when you push God out, the ethical and moral standards collapse. It may take a generation or two. But you can go through history and see empire after empire, nation after nation, people group after people group, individual leaders. And it's always the same way. Because when we do it our way causes conflict with others who want to do it their way. And the thing starts to fall apart. And there is no principle underpinning the ethical and moral standards. And the humanist position today, their principles essentially are derived second-hand from the teaching of Jesus, only they would never admit it. But give it a generation or two, they'll have gone, if we persist in this way. Eventually it gets so bad, so many people are being hurt, that God steps in. You don't have enough. You can think of some of the great disasters in Europe in the 20th century. God steps in. I've had enough. And key people are removed. And God then reclaims all that is his. Because everything belongs to God, he made it, including us. So the people groups lose everything. And I look out and see the historical records, the pictures. You can see it on television today on our screens, where with incessant bombing, everything is lost. Now we God's people, we mustn't take. We mustn't go in and plunder and steal for ourselves. Because it's not ours, it's God's. It must be totally destroyed. Given back to God, if you like, another way of putting it. So there must be no misappropriation. And that happens so often in war. People enter wars, they enter situations, they enter conflicts for what they can make on the side. And much that underpins what's happening in the Middle East. There are elements of which outside interference is because there's money to be made from oil and gas. Or there's power to be grasped by ruling a bigger area. Misappropriation is happening in front of our eyes. But God says, no, it's mine. And he's right. Now that's the concept of total destruction. And you'll find that idea starting strongly in the book of Joshua. And it is misunderstood. But that's the logic behind it. So let's leave that for the moment and move to other aspects. There's another bit that's difficult. For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a day of retribution to uphold Zion's cause. God, a God of vengeance, a year of retribution. What kind of God is this? Critics of the Bible pick on verses like that, usually using an old version where it makes it even more complex. And they laugh at the God that's pictured in the Bible. Now, it's their naivety. They don't understand what the words mean, and they don't understand the thing in context. So let's just pull it out a little bit. What is the eye of God's vengeance? Now, the real problem is the problem of language. When we have the word vengeance in English, it carries negative, horrible overtones, like a revenge. Now, in the original language, it doesn't quite carry that meaning at all, but it's almost impossible to translate. And many of our modern translations go back to earlier translations. We're stuck with the thought form of it. And they go back to English, which essentially is the English that Tyndale used, all the way back in the 16th century. And words have developed in their meaning, but the word in the Hebrew isn't an exact equivalent to any English word. That's the problem, and that's why critics are so naive. Because the word has an idea built into it, putting things right, or deliverance from wrongs done. You see, that's much more positive. And it's got that strong slant in the original word. And because words have changed their meaning and there is not exact translations possible, it's easy to be critical if we're ignorant. Human evil just gets totally out of hand. Though as I make this, I have just seen some of the pictures coming out of the Middle East. Indiscriminate barrel bombing of schools, hospitals and innocent children. Human evil gets totally out of hand. If human evil is getting out of hand, there it is in front of our eyes. And the innocent are getting destroyed. And I will say prophetically, God is going to intervene sooner or later. And those who have perpetrated this will find that they lose everything. Now, what the Bible makes absolutely clear is, none of us has the right to step in and put things right, to take the law into our own hands. And some of the troubles in the Middle East today are because we in the West intervened in things that we should never have intervened in. We took the law into our own hands. The Bible forbids that, because only God can do it. So it says the Lord has a day of vengeance. The Lord alone is in a position to know what's right, and he is in a position to put things right and to deliver people from terrible wrongs being done. Terrible things were being done to the nations round about by Assyria and later Babylon. Disasters were happening. People were suffering. Ordinary people were suffering. God will intervene to put things right, and he did. Assyria fell. Then Babylon fell. Their leadership ended up with nothing. You see, it comes to God. Only God can do this. The words day and year simply mean that God has a precise timing. He knows when to do it that's best. Now, we don't understand that, and we often criticize God. Why does he not intervene? God has given us freedom. And God just does not intervene willy-nilly. It's only when it gets completely out of hand. And the idea behind the word retribution is that actions have consequences. And if leadership and people groups persist in evil, there are consequences. They damage themselves, they damage their own societies, and in the end of the day, they will face justice. And it's to uphold Zion's cause. God wants to preserve his people so that we can live lives that will bless others and bring hope to a desperately needed world. And again, so many ignore this, but the facts speak for themselves that so many of the great benefits brought to mankind have come through the active involvement of the people of God. And it's still happening today. And that puts that very difficult little sentence into a bit of context. We need to ponder this. But moving on, from generation to generation the land will lie desolate. No one will ever pass through it again. God will stretch out over Edom the measuring line of chaos and the plumb line of desolation. Her nobles will have nothing there to be called a kingdom. All her princes will vanish away. Thorns will overrun her citadels. Nettles and brambles her strongholds. She'll become a haunt for jackals, a home for owls. They'll possess it forever and dwell there from generation to generation. And maybe for 1,000 years that was true of Edom. But remember, Edom is just an example of what will happen. And so much of that part of the world, indeed many other parts of the world, have ended up in chaos and desolation. And those with power and leadership lost it all. What a picture. But remember, it's vivid. We don't take it literalistically. Spoken poetry. You see, there's a devastation when people groups persistently reject God. When we think we can do it ourselves and we attack the people of God, well, actually, we don't do it very well. And we end up generating conflict, because doing it our own way generates conflict with others who don't get what they want because they want to do it their way. So you get jockeying for power, for possessions, for position, for rank, for influence. You can see it today. You can see it in front of your eyes on the television screen today. The suffering of ordinary people when leaders are jockeying for power, making sure that any alternative leader is put down, locked up in prison, removed from the scene. But they're corrupting themselves and they're corrupting their people, and in the end of the day they will leave behind total devastation. Sadly, that's what so often happens. Not a good picture. And I predict, as I look out in the world and watch the events unfolding in front of me, that there are parts of the world which are seedbeds of warfare today. And all these conditions are happening. People running their own affairs. Very often they may have some sort of religious system, but they are not going the way of God. Not going the way of love. Where leadership is not serving the led, but is lining its own pocket and seeking its own glory and reputation. And in the end, these societies will corrupt themselves and they will revert to chaos. And the leaders will be left with nothing. The tragedy is that so many innocent people will suffer on the way. God gave us freedom, and when we abuse that freedom, it can be utterly destructive. But as contrasts, chapter 34, now chapter 35. We mess it all up by our self-seeking. But when we bring God back into the frame, when we put him back at the centre, when we seek to live his way, fruitfulness comes. But the choice is yours, the choice is mine, and the choice is there for the world. So let's look at chapter 35. The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong. Do not fear, your God will come. He will come with vengeance. That's to put things right. With divine retribution. There are cause and effects. He will come to save you, to rescue you is perhaps better. It's poetry. We don't interpret it too literally, but its meaning is vivid. The magnificent trees of Lebanon gives us our homes. The fertility of the valley of Sharon near Mount Carmel, a food basket, pictures of God's provision. They will blossom. Hands that were helpless, knees that were unable to hold us up, hearts that were palpitating with fear and hopelessness, transformed. God's there for us to put things right. That's what vengeance and divine retribution mean. It's not negative, it's not vindictive, it's not harsh. God is love. Actions have consequences. God comes to put things right. And the great theologian said that if we will give God His glory, He will give His to us. What a deep thought. What a great perception. When we get God back on the throne of our cultures, societies, our church groups, our Christian groups, when we put Him back, we seek His way and do it His way, what can happen is just amazing and wonderful. We get all that fulfillment. His glory becomes ours. How gracious He is. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground, bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. You can see this at two levels. Spiritually, in the days of Isaiah, they couldn't see it. They couldn't hear God. They didn't know which way to go. And they didn't know what to say. But you can see it physically. That when God comes, when He's back at the center, Jesus brought healing. He restored the deaf. The lame were unable to walk. And those who couldn't speak were able to speak. And down through the years and today, in the name of Jesus, His faithful followers are releasing sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, movement to the lame, the ability to speak to those who cannot speak. That's what God can do for us. He wants the best for us. When something's gone wrong, He can transform and change and bring healing and renewal, spiritually, metaphorically, and physically. Don't rule out this physically. It's happening. Ignored by the media, but it still happens today. You see, that's what happens. We humans don't half mess up. We think we're clever. But we tend to turn our rich world into a desert. God takes the barren and the hopeless and He makes it abundant. Burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs. What a picture. And a highway will be there. It'll be called the way of holiness. It'll be there for those who walk on that way. The unclean will not journey on it. The wicked fools will not go about on it. No lion will be there, nor any ravenous beast. They will not be found there, but only the redeemed will walk there. And those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Remember, it's poetry. That speaks of a way of life. When we get God back at the center, individually, in our communities and as nation and people groups. When we recognize that we've made a mess of things, God's able to clean us up a way of holiness. Life transformation starts. And that means we start to live reflecting God's nature. His nature is love. His agenda is the best for you and me. And when we are transformed, our agenda is the best for the other, no matter who the other may be. That's the opposite of the leadership of Isaiah's day on the make. Remember the word folly. Nothing intellectual about it the way the word is used in the original language. It's those who consciously reject God's ways, and those who are noble are those who choose God's ways. This is for God's people, where we've taken a deliberate choice to do it His way. And that gives us complete security. It's the one thing we all want. We're scrabbling around for it. The first line is a very clever little sentence. It focuses on the rescued. And the second line focuses on the rescuer. God has rescued us, and we, rescued and secure, are on a journey of holiness, living for Him for the benefit of others, peaceful, happy, fulfilled the way God wants us to be. That's the option that's available for us. That's what God has for us. Yes, it is completed in heaven, but it's there for us now. Joy, peace, security. What an amazing picture. Chapter 34 pictures the fertile land that we humans mess up. Chapter 35, when we put God back on the throne, seek to do it His way. Life is transformed if only we would listen. Isaiah presented the choice to his people, to the leadership group particularly, most of whom rejected it. As a result, the land of Judah became a desert, roamed by wild animals, where it could have been the most glorious, fertile land for the benefit of the people. Isaiah's picture is very real. It fits what history shows is true, and it also fits the history of the time. I've summarized it that way. And as I look at that, my heart sinks. Throughout the Western world today, we are squeezing God to the margins of life, locking Him up in our churches and Christian groups, often mocking the way of Jesus and the standards that He set, which are designed to bring the best for life for all of us. And if we continue this way, I will say with complete certainty and tragically, the West will turn to become a desert. But when we decide to bring God back to the center of all life, that brings transformation. And it benefits everybody around. There's an enormous challenge for the people of God in the West. Even within our Christian groups, so often we've squeezed God to the edge, and we're running our religious systems. Let's get down on our knees and bring God back to the center, in whatever way He wants. In many other parts of the world, they're ahead of us, because the people of God have God back at the center. And their numbers are growing, and benefits are being brought, despite great difficulties. The choice is yours. The choice is mine. The choice is there for our Christian communities of the West and the culture that is the West. That is the prophecy of Isaiah. The next section will look at actually what did happen